All right, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we're going to dive into a pretty wild claim that's been making headlines. Did President Trump declare war on Mexico? We've got some pretty crazy sources here, so let's jump right in.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely important to understand, that President Trump did take some action against Mexican drug cartels, but it's not as straightforward as like a declaration of war, right? It's more complicated than that. What he did was sign these executive orders that classify the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, which is a pretty big deal and could have some far-reaching consequences.
Oh, yeah, definitely a big deal. One source we came across really went all in on the drama, saying that President Trump is like going for broke to protect America from this threat and using some pretty intense language like unofficial war against Mexico and talking about this historic bombshell.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of language it's definitely attention grabbing, but let's take a closer look at what these executive orders actually do. By classifying cartels as terrorist organizations, it could potentially give the U.S. military more authority to go after them.
So that brings us to this really interesting clip we found. The Secretary of Defense was asked directly if the U.S. military is now allowed to target cartels in Mexico. And his answer was, well, let's just say intriguing. He said, and I quote, "All options are on the table."
Wow, all options are on the table.
Yeah.
Pretty vague, isn't it? It doesn't really confirm or deny any specific action, but it definitely suggests that the U.S. government is thinking about a lot of different ways to deal with the cartels, which I think in itself raises even more questions, like what exactly are they willing to do, and how is Mexico going to react to all this?
Absolutely. I mean, you can't help but think about past U.S. interventions in Latin America, right? It adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing. And, one source even went so far as to say that the cartels are in for some big problems if the U.S. military gets involved.
Yeah, and that kind of talk, it really brings up the concern of, things escalating and maybe having unintended consequences. These cartels are not messing around. They're powerful, and they've got a long history of violence. A heavy-handed approach could easily backfire and make things even more unstable in the region.
That's true. It really makes you think about the potential ripple effects here. We're talking about military action on foreign soil in a neighboring country.
Yeah.
This isn't just some abstract policy debate. It has real consequences for real people on both sides of the border.
Yeah, absolutely. And the potential for things to get out of hand, it's a huge concern. I mean, if the U.S. starts taking a more aggressive stance, who knows what the cartels are going to do, could lead to even more violence, not only in Mexico, but potentially spilling over into the U.S. It's a really risky situation with a lot at stake.
So it sounds like we're dealing with a very, very complex situation here, and things could potentially spiral out of control pretty quickly. But what does this actually mean for everyday people? I mean, what would a conflict like this look like on the ground? And are there any other ways to deal with the cartels, without resorting to military force?
Those are really good questions, and they lead us to an even deeper examination of what could happen because of this policy, both the things people want to happen and the things they don't. We need to think about the human cost, the impact on international relations, and what this means for the U.S. and Mexico in the long run. And maybe even more importantly, we need to ask ourselves if there are other, maybe more effective ways to deal with these powerful cartels, ways that are less risky. It's kind of interesting, how this whole situation makes us rethink what war even means these days. Like, is it just about official declarations, or can it be, a bunch of actions and policies that keep escalating and lead to conflict, even if no one officially says we're at war?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's almost like we're in this gray area where the old definitions of war don't really fit anymore. And it's not just about, words and definitions, right? It's about how we frame this whole conflict and how that shapes people's perceptions and reactions to it.
Exactly. I mean, if it's called a war, it changes the story completely, right? It might make people think aggressive actions are okay. But it also brings up all this historical baggage and increases the chances of things going wrong.
So what kind of blowback are we talking about here? What could happen if we start calling this a war on cartels?
Well, for one thing, it could really hurt the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. If the U.S. starts doing military stuff in Mexico without their permission, it could look like an invasion, like we're disrespecting their sovereignty. That could easily make people in Mexico and the whole region feel even more anti-American.
Yeah, it'd be like shooting ourselves in the foot, right? Making it even harder to actually work with Mexico on this issue.
Exactly. And then there's the risk of making the conflict worse. The cartels are not going to back down easily. They're heavily armed, they're dangerous, and they're not afraid to use violence. If they feel like they're under attack, they're going to fight back. And that could pull the U.S. into a conflict that it might not be ready for.
Okay, so let's imagine for a minute that things do escalate and the U.S. ends up in a more direct conflict with the cartels.
Yeah.
What would that actually look like? What do we talk about here?
It's really tough to say for sure because there are so many factors involved, but I think we can get some idea of the potential problems by looking at past efforts to fight drugs. Like what happened when the U.S. got involved in Colombia's fight against their drug cartels. It was a long, expensive fight, and in the end, the results were kind of mixed.
Right. And Colombia's not the only example. We've seen similar things in Afghanistan and other places.
Mm-hmm.
And it's rare that there's like a clear winner. A lot of times these interventions just create more problems than they solve.
Yeah. And even if the U.S. did manage to weaken or take down some cartels, there's a good chance new groups would pop up to take their place. It's like whack-a-mole or something.
So it sounds like a war on cartels might not be the best way to go. If military intervention is so risky and unlikely to solve the problem in the long run, what other options are there?
Well, some experts think a better approach would be to get to the root of the problem, to address the things that make the drug trade possible in the first place. We're talking about poverty, inequality, corruption, things like that. So maybe instead of just focusing on military solutions, the U.S. and Mexico should be working together to create conditions where these criminal organizations can survive.
So instead of just going after the cartels with guns blazing, we need to look at the bigger picture. Try to build a more stable and fair society that doesn't create these kinds of criminal enterprises in the first place.
Exactly. It's about investing in things like economic development, making institutions stronger, improving education, and creating real opportunities for people in communities that have been left behind. In the long run, that kind of approach might be way more effective than any military intervention.
That does sound promising. But is there any evidence that this kind of approach actually works? Has any country actually managed to tackle organized crime by addressing these underlying social and economic issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, has anyone actually tried this and made it work?
Like I said, there's no perfect solution, right? But there are definitely some countries that have seen good results by focusing on long-term solutions instead of just trying to, wipe things out overnight. Portugal is a good example. Back in 2001, they decided to, get this, decriminalize all drugs. And they started putting more resources into treatment programs and harm reduction stuff.
Wait, so they decriminalized drugs to reduce drug problems. It seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Yeah, I know. It sounds kind of crazy, but the results have been pretty amazing. Drug-related deaths and HIV infections have gone way down. And they've also seen a big drop in drug-related crime.
Wow. So it's instead of treating drug use as a criminal thing, they're treating it as a public health issue. That's a big change in how we think about it.
It really is. And it's not just about changing the laws, right? It's about changing people's attitudes. It's about understanding that addiction is really complicated, and just punishing people who use drugs, it doesn't really work.
Makes you wonder if we've been fighting the wrong battle this whole time. What if instead of spending so much on the military and border security, we actually invested in those communities that are most affected by the drug trade?
Exactly. What if we focused on the demand side of things instead of just trying to cut off the supply? What if we gave people in these marginalized communities real opportunities, a real chance to succeed?
Yeah, there would be a huge shift in how we think about things.
Yeah.
I mean, letting go of that whole war on drugs mentality that we've had for so long.
Yeah, it would. And it would mean really addressing the root causes of this whole problem. Poverty, lack of education, limited economic opportunities, and all the corruption that keeps things stuck the way they are.
It's a lot to think about. It seems like a really big challenge, especially with the way things are politically right now. But if we really want to solve this problem, maybe we do need to try something new.
I think so. We need to move past those easy answers that don't really work and really grapple with how complicated this whole issue is. Yeah. There's no quick fix here. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of cooperation, and a commitment to solutions that actually last.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to chew on, huh? We started out asking if President Trump declared war on Mexico, and we ended up talking about, what war even means these days, the craziness of the drug trade, and what some different approaches might be. It's clear that this is a way more complicated issue than it might seem at first glance.
Totally. And I hope this conversation has, made you think a little more critically about the stuff you hear out there and question those simple answers that people throw around. the challenges we talked about, they're complex, and they require us to really think things through and be open to different points of view.
And that about wraps it up for this episode of The Deep Dive. We hope you keep exploring these issues and keep an open mind. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.